Welcome to V News Channel.
A Boeing 777 weighing over 200 tons was flying at nearly 900 km/h. At an altitude of 36,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, everything seemed completely normal, until suddenly, a deafening explosion tore through the silence inside the cabin. The aircraft jolted violently as if it had been struck in midair. In an instant, panic immediately spread out the passenger cabin as the aircraft shook violently. But the nightmare was far from over with 777, already more than 23 years old, nearly 40 degrees, flight path reaching the brink of losing control. The life minus or minus death question now was, could the pilot, which had suffered severe damage, bring all 378 people on board home? This is the story of United Airlines Flight 1175. February 13, 2018, San Francisco International Airport, California, USA. At gate gone, a Boeing 777 operated by United Airlines flight across the Pacific Ocean. On the apron, technicians and pilots were carrying out the final checks for takeoff. The flight, designated UA, was scheduled to fly from San Francisco to Honolulu, covering a distance of approximately 3,860 km in 40 minutes. There were a total of 378 people on board, including 363 passengers and 15 crew members. The captain was 57-year-old Christopher Benham, more than 13,000 hours of flight experience, and approximately 3,060 hours on the Boeing 777, more than 45 years in the aviation industry. Also gained experience flying light aircraft and had performed aerobatic maneuvers, techniques that require extremely precise aircraft control. Sitting in the right seat was First Officer Paul Ayar, aged 60. With more than 11,000 flight hours on the 777. It was Edgar Aaron, the United Airlines first officer who was off duty. He was seated in the jump seat, an observation position behind the two main pilots. The aircraft selected for the flight was a Boeing 777-200 and 23 years old. Since it was first manufactured, Boeing 777 had accumulated nearly 99,000 flight hours, more than 16,000 takeoff and landing cycles. Impresses anyone when they see the Boeing 777. Enormous engines, 4,077 turbofans mounted beneath the wings. These are high-minus bypass turbofan engines, with a twin-minus shaft design built to produce enormous thrust, high fuel efficiency, long-minus hull flights. With its massive size and powerful performance, the PW4077, one of the most powerful jet engines, were installed on the Boeing 777. 9:30 ADA. After nearly 40 minutes of touching on the ground, as soon as the clearance came from air traffic control, First Officer Pond pushed the thrust levers forward. The PW4077 engines roared to life, generating powerful thrusts forward. The massive Boeing 777 accelerated down the runway, lifted off the ground, beginning its journey across the Pacific Ocean. First Officer Pond would be the primary pilot in control of this flight. The first 3.5 hours of the flight completely normally. The aircraft had successfully climbed to its cruising altitude, 38,000 feet. Minutes later, UA 1175 only entered an area of moderate turbulence. To avoid this turbulent air, the crew contacted Honolulu Air Traffic Control and requested a descent of 6,000 feet, and their request was quickly approved. First Officer Pond immediately turned the adjustment knob on the flight control panel, allowing the autopilot system to begin the descent to the new cruising altitude. The flight then continued. But then, just when everything seemed exactly as planned, deep inside one of the two engines, a cracking fan blade number 11 silently grown to an irreversible point. In less than a millisecond, the massive fan blade broke apart, separating from its root, only about 3.5 centimeters from the blade root. With tremendous rotational force, it was thrown outward, almost immediately striking the adjacent fan blade, shattering the suck back into the engine core, and causing severe internal damage. Fan blade number 11 continued moving forward as protective casing. As a result, the entire forward section had torn away from the main structure. When the front section of the engine broke apart, several fragments of the fan blades had escaped the protective casing and slammed directly into the aircraft fuselage and the cockpit. The pilots had absolutely no idea what horrific event had just occurred. The only thing they could sense was a tremendous explosion, followed immediately by the sensation of just slammed straight into a massive brick wall there. The sudden deceleration was so violent that Venom and First Officer Pond were nearly thrown headfirst into the control panel. Less than 2 seconds later, the aircraft suddenly, sharply to the right by about 45 degrees, violently yawing in the same direction, shaking violently as if it were about to break apart in mid-minus air. Everything happened so quickly, no one in the flight crew could understand what had just happened. Captain Benham, with the experience of a training captain, immediately realized how serious the situation was. "I have control." He grabbed the control yoke, then disengaged the autopilot and the auto throttle system. Immediately afterward, he glanced down at the engine display he was almost certain of. A serious engine failure had just occurred. Yet, what appeared before him, completely contrary to what he had just felt. The engine readings were still completely normal. What the hell just happened? I don't know. The engine readings are still normal. That's impossible. At the same time, didn't Benham realize something else was seriously wrong? Seconds earlier, the Boeing 777 steadily at Mach 0.8. Roughly its normal cruising speed. Speed was dropping at an alarming rate. He understood that they had very little time to react. Whatever the cause, all the signs pointed to a problem on the right side. Instinctively, he pressed hard on the left rudder pedal and applied maximum left aileron. At the same time, left engine thrust lever to maximum, trying to generate as much thrust as possible to slow the deceleration. At that moment, he had only one goal in mind. Keep the aircraft from rolling over. After the captain's continuous efforts, the damaged Boeing finally began to return to a stable state. However, the speed continued to decrease, more than ever. Captain Benham understood very well what that meant and destroyed, and the aircraft would no longer be able to maintain its current altitude. 35 seconds after the nightmare began, the readings from the right engine on the display finally began disappearing one by one. In fact, when the engine casing was destroyed in the impact, the engine's control computer system damaged and stopped transmitting data to the cockpit. Therefore, what the pilots had seen earlier were only the engine's final parameters, or it failed, frozen on the display. Because the system was no longer receiving new data, the moment finally confirmed what the flight crew feared the most. The right engine had suffered severe damage. Without hesitating for another second, and Benham immediately instructed First Officer Pond the emergency checklist. Engine service damage on the aircraft's electronic checklist system. They immediately faced another problem. The 177 was shaking so violently. First Officer Pond reached the controls to operate them. And it was precisely in this critical situation these Veron pilots became their lifeline. There was one important detail that had not yet been mentioned. Had previously flown aircraft that used memory items. Procedures had to be memorized immediately without rereading the checklist. So they began carrying out the procedure entirely from memory. Fortunately, after these steps were completed, the aircraft's vibration decreased slightly, was still extremely severe. Therefore, the entire flight crew, which this would completely isolate the right engine. while shutting off all fuel and related hydraulic systems. And as expected, immediately after the action, aircraft's vibration dropped sharply, around 15 to around 7. Although it had decreased significantly, the situation remained extremely serious. This vibration was still enough to throw the entire cabin into panic. At least now, begin getting the situation under control. The electronic checklist system was still very difficult. Aircraft continued to shake violently, and then S, who was sitting in the jump seat, opened his iPad. Dad. That moment, he had also just completed his training, so the emergency checklists were still very familiar to it. The scale. That became a truly valuable source of assistance. Seeing that the situation had stabilized somewhat, First Officer S to contact air traffic control. Emergency. S immediately picked up the radio and issued an emergency call. Mayday. Mayday. Spirit. Mayday. This is United Airlines 1175 to airport. Hey again. One of our engines has suffered severe damage, an emergency landing. Immediately after receiving instructions from air traffic control, immediately focused their full attention. As of 378 people on board were now in their hands. And their only goal now was to get the Boeing 777 back on the ground. Fortunately, the aircraft was still descending steadily. Captain Benham asked First Officer Pond to calculate the optimal speed. Drift minus down procedure. The safe descent procedure when the aircraft is operating with only one engine. While Paul was calculating the best airport for landing was still Honolulu. However, the aircraft was still about 370 kilometers away. Know the true extent of the damage, or how much longer it could remain airborne. Every action was performed carefully and decisively. Steward calculated the optimal speed and altitude to be 425 km/h. At an altitude of around 23,000 feet. However, when Captain Benham began accelerating the aircraft, Boeing 777 began shaking even more violently. Seconds later, the crash stall warning system began blaring loudly. Clearly, that should not have happened at that speed, but somehow it was happening anyway. Captain Benham reacted instinctively, immediately lowering the aircraft's nose. But when he did so, the descent rate suddenly increased to 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute. If this rate continued, the aircraft could very likely plunge into the ocean, Honolulu. Realizing that they needed to know exactly into the engine, Captain Benham made another decision. He asked S, the first officer sitting in the rear jump seat, to go into the passenger cabin and inspect the engine and return and report back. A few minutes later, with a terrifying video on his phone. In the video, the extent of the engine damage was horrificously clear. One fan blade had broken off. The remaining blades were still spinning in the airflow, shaking violently beneath the wing, to the aerodynamic forces acting on it. No one in the cockpit knew how much longer the engine could remain attached to the wing that had already broken loose. Additional damage to the aircraft, but the uncertainty in the cockpit grew even greater. Time continued to pass, and Captain Benham kept calculating the situation in his head. As the aircraft began preparing for the landing phase, more and more unusual warnings and checklists began appearing on the electronic systems in the cockpit. As they descended below 10,000 feet, first officers transferred fuel from the right tank, left engine, to ensure the remaining engine continued operating reliably. Shortly afterward, began calculating the landing approach. The sky was still cloudy, but fortunately visibility remained good and the wind was favorable.
Honolulu Approach Control initially proposed guiding them onto the ILS approach for runway 04R, but Captain Benham and S quickly realized that this runway was too short for a Boeing 777 flying fast on only one engine. Runway 08L was long enough, but it was closed for repairs, so the crew requested a switch to runway 08R. This runway was long enough, but had no ILS system, which meant the crew would have to make a manual approach with only one engine.
While the aircraft was still shaking violently, it was an enormous challenge. But at this point, what worried Captain Benham more than anything was not the landing, but whether the aircraft could actually reach. He asked Paul to tell air traffic control to guide them as close to land as possible. If the worst minus-case scenario occurred, ditch in the ocean. Sheltered waters on the leeward side of the island would have smaller waves. Survival would be higher. After a brief discussion in the cockpit, the three pilots came up with a clear plan. Benham focused entirely on flying the aircraft, while S, from the jump seat, has a manual approach radar, continuously providing guidance and display. The goal was to reduce the captain's workload and keep the approach as stable as possible. As they began the approach, he deliberately kept the aircraft slightly higher and faster, to ensure they still had enough kinetic energy to reach the runway when occurred. Finally, they decided to approach with 20 degrees of left bank at a speed of about 270 km/h. As the aircraft continued along the approach path, the speed was reduced very gradually. As the speed decreased, the captain had to use more and more rudder to maintain heading, as control effectiveness gradually decreased with speed. Well, third eye for P. Boeing 700 Honolulu time finally broke through the clouds, and the runway appeared directly ahead. The control tower immediately cleared them to land, while all the emergency fire and rescue vehicles standing by along the runway. 20 seconds later, the landing gear was down. 3 green lights illuminated, sign that the landing gear was securely locked. The massive Boeing 777 slowly glided over the runway threshold, vehicles following closely behind. At that moment, Captain Benham entered a state of absolute concentration. The massive Boeing 777 was descending toward the runway. Only one engine still operating. The craft was still vibrating slightly. Spin through.
He kept the control column steady, making tiny adjustments to every movement.
Trying to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway. Runway 08R was now directly below.
The aircraft passed over the runway threshold, a few meters above the ground. 12:37 p.m. 15. The captain gently pulled back on the control column. Landing gear touched down. There was no hard impact, no screech of metal. Just an unbelievably smooth touchdown. An aircraft that had just suffered an engine failure of the Pacific Ocean. The Boeing 777 continued rolling down the runway. Emergency fire and rescue vehicles rushed along behind it. And Hum kept the aircraft centered on the runway, slowly reducing thrust and gently applying the brakes. The massive aircraft gradually slowed down to the Romeo Gulf taxiway and came to a complete stop. Inside the cockpit, a few heavy seconds of silence passed. He quietly said, Captain, you can let go now." Only then did Benham realize that for nearly 40 minutes, he had been gripping the control column with his left hand, and the thrust levers with his right hand, and go even once. After the airport, when firefighting teams inspected the aircraft was confirmed safe enough to taxi back to the gate. A few minutes later, the aircraft doors opened. 363 passengers and 12 flight attendants stepped off one by one. No one was injured. A flight that had seemed completely normal, with one of the most astonishing landings in the history of modern aviation. The subsequent investigation concluded that catastrophic engine failure, caused by a metal fatigue crack in the fan blade, the very crack mentioned earlier. The investigation also revealed serious shortcomings. X-ray inspection procedures. Missions had previously detected signs of the crack, failed to flag it as an issue requiring attention. During the incident, these inspection procedures were significantly improved in standards for technicians. Shorter inspection intervals for engine fan blade, engine protective structure. Of the flight crew during the incident are used as an exemplary case of crew resource management, or CRM, in airlines training programs, as well as those of many other airlines. July 18, 2019, Captain Christopher Benham and First Officer Paul A.R. were presented with the Superior Airmanship Award by the Airline Pilots Association, ILPA. Outstanding Coordination Incident.